John was at the peak of despair. Everything he had built seemed to be crumbling, like a sandcastle swept away by the tide. The business he had started with so much passion had failed, and with it, his self-confidence. The criticism from those around him, friends, neighbors, even family, felt like daggers piercing his already fragile soul. In the silence of the night, he questioned his worth, his abilities, and even the purpose of his life. But in the darkest shadow, a small light began to shine. An old friend, Carlos, reached out and reminded him of something John had forgotten: the power of faith and the strength that comes from believing that God has a plan, even in the darkest moments. John's journey was anything but easy. Through tears and sleepless nights, he had to confront his fears, listen to his heart above the negative voices, and make decisions that would forever change his destiny. And just when everything seemed to be falling into place, fate presented him with yet another challenge, perhaps the greatest of all. Would John be able to endure and prove that faith, determination, and God's love are truly stronger than any obstacle? Before we dive in, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Stick with us until the end, because this story might just surprise you more than you expect. The weight of failure. John sat at the edge of his bed, the room dark, illuminated only by the pale light seeping through the gaps in the curtains. The ticking of the clock on the wall marked the passing minutes, but for him, time felt frozen. His hands trembled as he held a debt collection letter, just one among many. Another cruel reminder that his dream, the business he believed was his life's calling, had turned into a financial disaster. The silence in the house was suffocating, but it wasn't louder than the constant noise in his mind. "You were never good enough," an inner voice echoed, joining the criticism from people quick to point out his failures. "I knew this wouldn't work out," an aunt had said during the last family dinner, her disdainful tone replaying over and over in his head. He no longer knew how he had ended up here. When he started the business, John was full of enthusiasm. He had planned every detail, convinced that his idea would change his life and make his family proud. But reality was harsh. A lack of experience, poor decisions, and maybe a bit of bad luck had led to a bankruptcy that seemed to have drained not just his finances but also his hope. In recent months, John avoided meeting people's eyes on the street. Even going to church, which had always been a source of comfort, now felt impossible. How could he raise his hands in prayer when he felt that God had abandoned him? On one of those sleepless nights, sitting on his bed with bills scattered across the floor, John did something he hadn't done in a long time: he cried. Not a quiet, restrained cry, but a deep, desperate sob that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. "Why, God," he murmured, his voice breaking. "Why did you let this happen to me? I tried. I gave it everything I had. But now I have nothing left." He waited for an answer, but the room remained silent. Only the sound of the wind against the window seemed to reply, as if the world itself was mocking his pain. That night, John fell asleep amidst his tears, his heart heavy and his mind clouded. Little did he know, that moment of profound despair would be the beginning of something that would change his life forever. The next day, as he stepped outside for a walk to clear his mind of the swirling negativity, John encountered someone he hadn't seen in years, someone who carried a message he desperately needed to hear. The criticism and the discouragement. The morning sun lit up the narrow streets of the town, but John barely noticed. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the world around him was cloaked in a dull gray, despite the bright blue sky above. With his hands shoved deep into his pockets and his head hanging low, he tried to avoid the gaze of others. After all, he knew what everyone thought, and some didn't even bother to hide it. As he passed a group of acquaintances in the square, John heard muffled laughter. One of the women, Mrs. Rosa, leaned over and whispered to another. He was so full of plans, but look at him now. A failure. The words struck him like stones against his chest. John pretended not to hear but felt his face flush with shame. This wasn't the first time he'd faced such remarks. Ever since his small business had shut down, it seemed everyone felt entitled to comment on his life. Later that day, he chose to take a detour to avoid walking down a street where he knew he might run into Paul, an old friend who loved to remind him of his mistakes. "I told you, John. This kind of thing isn't for humble folks like us." Paul had said it so many times that the phrase seemed etched in John's mind. As he walked, he couldn't escape the negative thoughts swirling in his head. What if they're right, he wondered. Maybe it was foolish to believe that he, a simple man, could achieve something so big. Maybe it had been arrogance to think that God would help him when so many others were also struggling. No matter how hard he tried to push these thoughts away, they consumed him like a raging storm. John thought back to the early months of his business, when hope had been abundant. He had poured countless hours into it, often sacrificing time with his family, believing that hard work would pay off. But now, looking back, it all seemed meaningless. The weight of the criticism and his own lack of motivation formed chains that dragged him deeper into despair. John began to question even the simplest things. He no longer had the energy to dream or the strength to believe that better days were possible. It was then that he felt a hand gently rest on his shoulder. Turning around, he met the warm gaze of Carlos, a childhood friend he hadn't seen in years. Carlos's genuine smile was a stark contrast to the chaos John felt inside. "John. It's been so long, my friend. How are you?" For a moment, John hesitated. Part of him wanted to pour out everything, to share the turmoil he was facing, but another part held him back. After all, what could Carlos possibly say that he hadn't heard before? I'm trying, Carlos," John replied, his voice lacking conviction. Carlos tilted his head, studying John's face with care. "You know, you don't have to try alone. Let's grab a coffee. I want to hear your story." Reluctant, but too tired to refuse, John agreed. What he didn't expect was that this coffee would mark the beginning of a radical change in his life, a change that would start with Carlos's unexpected and inspiring words. The meeting with Carlos. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the small cafe as John and Carlos settled at a table in the corner. John was restless, fiddling with the spoon he'd used to stir his cup. Carlos, in contrast, seemed calm, watching his friend with a compassionate look, as if he understood that the silence held much more than words could say. "So, John," Carlos began gently. "Tell me. What's going on? You're not the same guy full of ideas and dreams I used to know." John gave a weak smile but quickly looked away. For a moment, the clinking of cups and the hum of conversations around them faded, leaving only the weight of his frustration. Taking a deep breath, he started to speak, hesitant at first, but soon the words poured out like a dam breaking. He told Carlos everything, the dream of starting his business, the initial months of excitement, the challenges that followed, and eventually, the failure. He spoke about how people's criticisms cut him deeply, how he felt he'd let everyone down, and most painfully, how he'd let himself down. By the time he finished, his voice was trembling, and his eyes glistened with tears. Carlos listened without interruption, his patience surprising John. When he finally spoke, his words were calm and steady. "John, do you know what the greatest failure in life is? It's giving up." John blinked, taken aback. Carlos continued. Listen, I went through something similar a few years ago. I lost my job, my house, and almost my will to live. I thought there was no way out. But one day, someone reminded me of something I'd forgotten: God never abandons those who trust Him. That's when I realized I had to stop listening to the critics and start listening to what God had to say. John frowned, skeptical. And what did God have to say to you, Carlos? Because honestly, I don't hear anything anymore. Carlos smiled, leaning forward. He reminded me that the best plans aren't always ours. Sometimes, what feels like the end is just a detour towards something much greater. But, John, to see that, you have to believe there's still a purpose for your life, and start cultivating that belief in your mind. John sat quietly, Carlos's words echoing in his heart. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. Carlos, he said softly, I don't know where to start. I don't even know if I have the strength anymore. Carlos placed a reassuring hand on John's shoulder, gripping it firmly. Start by giving that pain to God. Do what I did, take it one step at a time. You don't have to have all the answers right now. But you do need to believe that better days are ahead. John looked at his friend, absorbing the words like rain on parched soil. For the first time in months, he felt truly heard and understood. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to start over. Before they left, Carlos placed something in John's hands, a small, worn book with the title, God's Promises, embossed in gold letters. Read this, John, Carlos said with a smile. And come find me when you're ready to talk again. Because real change starts here. Planting the seed of faith. That night, sitting in his small living room, John held the book Carlos had given him. God's Promises, the title sounded hopeful, yet distant. He ran his fingers over the worn cover, hesitant to open it. Over the past few months, John had drifted from his faith. It wasn't that he didn't believe in God, but the weight of failure and the feeling of abandonment made him doubt if God was still listening to his prayers. After a few moments, he sighed, opened the book, and began to read. The first pages contained verses that seemed simple at first glance, but as he reread them, something about the words struck a deep chord in his heart. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Jeremiah 29 verse 11. Those words felt like a promise spoken directly to him. As he read them, warm tears rolled down his face. It was as if something inside him was stirring, a small flame reigniting after being extinguished for so long. He spent hours reading the book, page by page, underlining verses that spoke of strength, courage, and trust in God. But more than that, John began to talk to God, something he hadn't done in a long time. It wasn't a formal prayer, it was simple, almost whispered words, but they carried raw honesty. God, I know I've failed. I know I haven't always listened to your voice. But if there's still a plan for me, please show me the way. That night, John felt a peace he couldn't explain. He still didn't have answers to his problems, but for the first time, he believed there might be a purpose amidst the chaos. In the days that followed, John started making small changes to his routine. Each morning, he read passages from the Book of Promises, allowing those words to renew his mind. The criticism from others still stung, but gradually, he began to tune out those voices and listen more to the inner voice that told him, you can start again. The real transformation began one morning when John had an idea. Reflecting on the verses he had read and Carlos's words, the best plans aren't always ours, he began to wonder what God might be showing him. Could his past failure have been a detour leading to something greater? Feeling inspired, he grabbed a notebook and started writing. The words flowed effortlessly, as if they'd been waiting to be put on paper. John sketched out ideas for a new project, different from his previous one, simpler, but still full of potential. This time, he decided to move slowly, with humility, and to seek God's guidance every step of the way. John felt excited by his notes, but an unexpected message on his phone interrupted his thoughts. It was from Carlos. "I need you to come with me tomorrow. I think you'll like what I have to show you." John agreed, unaware that the meeting the next day would bring a revelation that would change the direction of his plans forever. The first step. The next morning, John woke up with his heart caught between anxiety and curiosity. Carlos's invitation had been cryptic, but it stirred a sense of anticipation he hadn't felt in a long time. He dressed quickly, grabbed his notebook, perhaps on impulse, and left to meet his friend. Carlos was waiting for him in the square, near the small church where they had spent much of their childhood. When John arrived, Carlos waved with a warm smile and gestured toward his car. "Ready for an adventure?" John chuckled, still unsure what to expect. "You're not going to tell me where we're going?" "Not yet," Carlos replied with a wink. "But trust me, it's a place that'll inspire you." The car traveled down dusty dirt roads until they reached a small, secluded property. There stood a simple but lively building. People were coming and going, carrying boxes, while others sat on makeshift benches, chatting and smiling. Everyone seemed immersed in something bigger, sharing an energy that filled the air. "Welcome to our community center," Carlos said as he parked. "Community center?" John asked, intrigued. "Yes," Carlos replied. "This place was created to help people like you, folks going through tough times. Here, they get guidance, learn new skills, and, most importantly, rediscover their purpose." John remained silent, taking in the scene before him. It was a humble space, but it radiated a sense of hope. Carlos noticed his contemplative expression and continued. "John, I brought you here because I believe you have something unique to offer. That failure you're so afraid of? Maybe it was the training ground for you to help others overcome their struggles." Carlos led him into a simple room where a group of young people had gathered. They were brainstorming ideas for small businesses and discussing ways to save resources. John listened for a few minutes, surprised by their creativity and enthusiasm. He felt a pang in his heart. It was as though this scene was rekindling a passion he had buried long ago. One young man, named Peter, presented an idea for starting a small recycling workshop but seemed unsure how to begin. Without thinking, John stepped in. "Have you considered starting with something simple, like repurposing donated items into basic products? It could be a great starting point." Peter's eyes lit up. "You think that could work?" "With dedication and a solid plan, yes," John replied, more confidently than he expected. Carlos watched from a distance, a satisfied smile on his face. After the session ended, he approached John and said, "See? You still have so much to give. And more than that, you can start over. God gave you talents, John, and maybe it's time to use them in a different way." As they drove back home, John felt something had shifted within him. For the first time in months, he didn't just see possibilities, he believed in them. Back in his living room, John revisited his notebook with renewed focus. But as he turned a page, he stumbled upon a scribbled idea from months ago, long forgotten, an ambitious dream, one he had dismissed as too bold. Could this dream be the next step in his journey? The first stumbles. John's living room was dimly lit by the yellow glow of a single hanging bulb. He flipped through his notebook, his eyes fixed on an idea he had scribbled months ago, a vision now more alive than ever. It was an ambitious project, something he had dreamed up in a moment of inspiration but had quickly shelved for lack of courage. His dream was to create a support network for small entrepreneurs, a place where people like him, those who had failed or didn't know where to start, could receive practical and spiritual guidance to rebuild. John believed his painful experience could serve as a tool to help others avoid the mistakes he had made. With his heart racing, he began sketching out the first steps. His mind buzzed with ideas, how the space would work, the type of support it could offer, and how he could involve people like Carlos to provide wisdom and inspiration. But as he wrote, old doubts began to creep in. Am I dreaming too big again? The next day, John shared his ideas with Carlos, who listened attentively and enthusiastically. This is amazing, John. You already have a clear purpose and vision. But you know, it won't be easy. John nodded, offering a faint smile. He knew the journey ahead would be full of challenges. And those challenges arrived sooner than he expected. When he started looking for ways to put his plan into action, John quickly realized he would need resources, something he didn't have. He tried reaching out to a few acquaintances, but most greeted him with skepticism. John, you already tried and failed. What makes you think this time will be different? Nice ideas on paper, but the real world is harsh. Each negative comment was a blow to his confidence. He found himself once again grappling with his insecurities. For days, he felt paralyzed, trapped in a cycle of doubt and fear of failure. One afternoon, seeking clarity, John wandered through the square and, almost instinctively, entered the church. The quiet atmosphere enveloped him, and he knelt, his heart heavy. God, I'm trying to trust you, but it's so hard. I feel like I'm not enough. If this plan is truly your purpose for me, please give me strength to continue. Show me a direction. He stayed there for a long time, silent. When he finally stood, he didn't have all the answers, but he felt a peace that gave him the courage to take another step. In the days that followed, John decided to simplify his approach. He started small, gathering a few people at Carlos's house to discuss ideas and share experiences. The meetings were modest but impactful. He realized that while resources were scarce, the desire to help was enough to begin. During one of these meetings, a man John didn't recognize walked into the room. He seemed intrigued, listening attentively, but there was something in his gaze that piqued John's curiosity. After the discussion, the man introduced himself and, to John's surprise, made an unexpected proposal, one that had the potential to change everything but came with risks John wasn't sure he was ready to take. Innovation and creativity. The room buzzed with murmurs and anticipation. John, still reeling from the unexpected arrival of the unknown man, tried to maintain his composure while observing him closely. The visitor was an older gentleman with gray hair, a serious expression, and a curious gaze that took in every detail of the space. He waited patiently until the meeting ended before stepping forward to introduce himself. "My name is Antonio," he said, shaking John's hand. "I've been listening to your idea, and I must say, you have something special here." John tilted his head, intrigued. "Thank you, Mr. Antonio. But if I may ask, what brought you here?" Antonio offered a faint smile. "I heard about this gathering by chance. Carlos mentioned it while helping at the community center, and I decided to check it out. I'm also an entrepreneur and have had my share of ups and downs. Something about what you're doing reminded me of my own struggles." John nodded, still unsure what to make of the conversation. Then Antonio made a surprising proposal. "I want to help you expand this. I have some capital and contacts that could give your idea a real boost. But you'll need to convince me that you're ready to innovate, step out of your comfort zone, and face even harsher criticism." The weight of Antonio's words pressed on John's shoulders. He thanked him and asked for time to think it over. In the days that followed, John wrestled with his decision. On one hand, Antonio's offer seemed like an answer to his prayers. On the other, the fear of failure loomed large once again. In a moment of clarity, John returned to his notebook and began brainstorming new possibilities. He explored creative ways to move forward using the limited resources at hand while building a stronger foundation for the future. Then, a brilliant idea struck him. What if he combined hands-on workshops with principles of faith and resilience? With this fresh perspective, John presented his updated plan to Antonio, who listened with keen interest. The older man seemed impressed by John's boldness and the depth of his proposal. "You've got potential, John. I'll invest, but on one condition: you must lead the first workshop yourself, using your story as the foundation. People need to see that overcoming challenges is possible." A chill ran down John's spine. Speaking in public, especially about his own failures, was far from his comfort zone. But he knew this was a necessary step. The day of the first workshop was fast approaching, and the weight of responsibility grew heavier on John's shoulders. On the night before the event, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown sender. The text read, "You think you can inspire anyone? Remember where you came from. This will fail, just like everything else you've tried." John's heart sank. Was it just a provocation? Or was someone deliberately trying to sabotage him before he even began? The rise of the business. The night before the workshop was supposed to be one of preparation and focus, but John couldn't shake the tension. The anonymous message that had appeared on his phone read, "You can try, but everyone knows this will just be another failure. Some people aren't meant to succeed." He reread those words more times than he cared to admit, as if searching for a reason behind their cruelty. They reopened old wounds, stirring up his fear of failing in front of an audience and confirming the doubts of those who expected him to fall short. But just as he was about to give in to despair, he remembered Carlos's words. "God doesn't choose the qualified, John. He qualifies the chosen." With that truth echoing in his mind, John resolved to dismiss the message and focus on what truly mattered. He spent the night finalizing details, praying for clarity and composure. The next morning, the hall where the workshop was to take place was filled with people. Young individuals seeking guidance, curious local entrepreneurs, and even a few familiar faces he knew had doubted his abilities were in attendance. John took a deep breath as he entered the room, feeling the weight of every gaze fixed on him. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice slightly shaky. "Today, I want to share something with you, not just about business, but about the strength we find when everything seems lost." Gradually, John began recounting his story, from the highs and lows of his first business to the invaluable lessons he had learned along the way. He spoke candidly about his doubts, fears, and the devastating impact of criticism, but he also highlighted how his faith had helped him rise again. "Failure isn't the end," he said, meeting the audience's eyes. "It's a chance to start over with more wisdom. And most importantly, it's a reminder that God is working behind the scenes, even when we can't see it." The effect was immediate. People began engaging, sharing their own stories, and asking questions. The workshop wasn't just a success, it became the foundation of a support community where individuals felt safe to dream again. At the end of the event, Antonio approached with a proud smile. "You've found your voice, John. This is just the beginning." In the months that followed, John's project gained momentum. With Antonio's financial backing and Carlos's involvement, they expanded the workshops and attracted more participants. The innovative approach of blending practical training with spiritual principles proved transformative, changing lives and inspiring people to believe in themselves again. As the project gained recognition in the community, John received an unexpected proposal, an invitation to bring his initiative to a larger city. Was this an opportunity to expand his mission or a risky move that could jeopardize everything he'd built so far? John knew he would need to weigh the options carefully before taking the next step in his journey. The great adversity. John held the invitation in his hands, reading every word over and over. The proposal was monumental: take his project to a larger city, reach more people, and impact lives on a scale he had never imagined. But with the opportunity came significant risks. Accepting it meant leaving the safe, familiar environment he had built with so much effort. Carlos and Antonio were the first to hear about the proposal. Carlos, ever the optimist, offered his usual encouraging words. "John, sometimes God calls us into deeper waters. And while it may feel intimidating, that's where the greatest miracles happen." Antonio, however, took a more pragmatic approach. "I believe in your potential, John, but expanding is risky. We need to make sure we have the resources and the team to sustain what we've built while taking this leap." John spent days in prayer, seeking discernment. He wanted to trust that God was guiding him, but he was afraid of risking everything he had rebuilt. While he wrestled with this decision, an unexpected problem arose. Some members of the local community began questioning his intentions. Rumors spread, accusing John of using the project for personal gain. "He's just going to leave us behind now that he has a bigger opportunity," some said. Those words cut deeply. John had poured his heart and soul into the project, always prioritizing others' well-being over his own. The criticism made him question himself once again. That night, seeking solace, John turned to prayer. He opened his notebook and revisited his original ideas. As he reread his notes, he was reminded of the greater purpose behind it all. His mission had never been about pleasing everyone, it was about obeying the call he felt in his heart. Determined to face the criticisms head-on, John called a meeting with the community to address their concerns. He spoke with honesty, laying out the challenges and opportunities that expansion would bring. Most importantly, he reaffirmed his commitment to the people who had been the heart of the project from the very beginning. "I didn't get here alone," he said, making eye contact with everyone in the room. "And if this project grows, it will be because God has equipped us to grow together." Though some skepticism remained, many could feel the sincerity in his words. Gradually, the critical voices began to fade, replaced by cautious support. Just as the planning phase for expansion began, a new challenge emerged: an important sponsor withdrew their financial backing. Without the promised funding, the entire project was at risk. Now facing tight deadlines and dwindling resources, John was confronted with his most difficult decision yet. Should he trust that God would provide a solution, or should he step back and delay the expansion, risking the loss of this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity? The final triumph. John sat on his porch, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The trees swayed gently in the wind, but he barely noticed. The news of the sponsor's withdrawal had hit him like a sudden blow, throwing the entire expansion plan into jeopardy. He opened his notebook, where he had meticulously outlined every detail of the project, and flipped through the pages, searching for a solution. But the more he tried to find a way forward, the heavier his heart grew. For the first time in weeks, doubt crept back into his mind. "Maybe I've gone too far," he muttered to himself. "Maybe this is a sign that I should stop before things get worse." That night, John knelt on the floor of his room and prayed with an intensity he hadn't felt before. "God, I don't know what to do anymore. I trusted that this was your plan, but now everything seems to be falling apart. If this expansion is truly what you want, please show me the way. And if it isn't, help me accept that." When he finished, a peace he couldn't explain settled over him. He still didn't have the answers he sought, but he felt reassured that he wasn't alone. The next day, while walking through the square to clear his mind, John saw Carlos approaching with a wide grin on his face. "John, you won't believe what just happened," Carlos said, holding a piece of paper. It was a message from a local entrepreneur Carlos had recently met. The man, impressed by John's initiative, was willing to invest in the project. But more than that, he proposed a collaborative approach involving other small investors who could contribute in various ways. "Looks like God's opening another door," Carlos said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. With this new support, John was able to revise the expansion plan. The project was restructured to start on a smaller scale but with the potential to grow steadily. John realized this adjustment was a hidden blessing, allowing him to focus on quality and meaningful impact. The expansion finally became a reality. The project launched in a larger city, with workshops packed with participants and a new network of volunteers eager to help. The criticisms that had once shaken John turned into recognition and support. He became a symbol of resilience and faith, inspiring others to pursue their dreams despite obstacles. At a special event celebrating the project's success, John stepped onto the stage to thank everyone who had supported him. Speaking with the same sincerity that had guided him throughout his journey, he said, "If there's one thing I've learned on this journey, it's that God never fails. Even when everything seems lost, He is working behind the scenes. My failure was just the beginning of a much bigger plan, and today I can say with certainty, faith transforms, and determination, coupled with trust in God, can move mountains." His words resonated deeply with everyone in the room. John hadn't just rebuilt his life, he had created a legacy that would help countless others find their purpose. And so, John discovered that the greatest challenges are often opportunities to demonstrate faith and courage. From that moment on, his story became a beacon of inspiration, proving that dreams can be realized when we trust that God is guiding our steps, even through the fiercest storms. Now it's your turn to reflect. John's story reminds us that even when everything seems lost, God works silently to write new chapters in our lives. Have you ever faced a moment when criticism or failure nearly made you give up? Maybe you felt like there was no hope left, but somehow, you found the strength to keep going. We want to hear from you. Share in the comments how faith, courage, or even an unexpected helping hand changed the course of your story. Or, if you're still facing challenges, let us know. Together, we can encourage one another. Remember, every stumble can be the start of an incredible transformation, and your story might just inspire someone else to never give up. If this narrative touched your heart, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Here, every story has the power to warm the soul and renew hope. Join us and help spread this message to more people who need to hear that with God, all things are possible. This is the Stories That Embrace channel. Stay with God, and see you in the next story.